Good evening. A very warm welcome to you to the fourth dialogue in the WISCOMP dialogue series. WISCOMP is privileged to collaborate with IIC on this series. We are grateful to IIC, especially Ms. Tete, for making this webinar possible. WISCOMP, as you are aware, is an initiative of the Foundation for Universal Responsibility of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. It positions its work at the intersection of gender, security, conflict resolution, and peace. It foregrounds women's voice, visibility, and leadership in these areas. One of the aspects of WISCOMP's research and training programs is nurturing gender just and inclusive campuses and higher education spaces. The dialogue today on pedagogy in the times of the pandemic is informed by this work. The uncertainties over the end of the COVID pandemic and related restrictions in recent months has brought unprecedented public attention to education. The dialogue is being held at a time which normally would be a period of hustle and bustle of new admissions on campuses. But all that seems remote as admissions, student orientations, and classes have all moved online. Campuses are silent in some senses. Dr. Meenakshi Gopinath, the WISCOMP director, in a recently published article, eloquently stated that what the campus in the last 1 year has been, and I quote, educators missed out on the thrill of the everyday shared epiphanies of the proximate classroom space, the flicker of recognition at the acceptance of an idea, the quizzical articulations, the unmediated communication that is the authentic barometer of learning resonance and the spur to motivation. Students missed out on vital aspects of college experience, the intensity of co-curricular endeavor, the allure of sports field, the camaraderie of cultural engagement, the life-changing interactions in hostels, the friendly sparring of dialogue and debate, the discovery of unfamiliar worlds, new calibrations of identity, autonomy, and freedom, and the tangible lessons in citizenship, bargaining, and coexistence. Unquote. The pandemic has wrought a range of challenges on higher education. Besides the obvious impacts on learning processes and the psychological well being of students and faculty, it has brought to the fore the ability of the academy to rise to the challenge of the crisis we face today. We are all aware that the pandemic has exacerbated inequalities of class, caste, gender, and locational difference in multiple ways. For instance, the effects of iniquitous access to livelihoods, healthcare, information and communication technology, so on and so forth. The list could go on. How are faculty and students dealing with this inequity? What initiatives have institutes started to address them? What are the limitations of these initiatives? And again, how has the disruption in the academy affected young faculty who were just starting their careers when the pandemic hit? What insights do their experiences offer into the mindscapes of thousands of other young professionals in areas outside educational campuses? We have with us today a panel of eminent educators who will address these and other questions. The opening remarks will be delivered by Professor Krishna Menon. Professor Menon teaches gender studies at B.R. Ambedkar University and is also the former Dean of School of Human Studies at the university. She's earlier taught at Lady Shri Ram College for over 2 decades. She's published several books, papers, articles on gendered readings of politics, political theory, and social movements. She's currently one of the editors in chief of the International Feminist Journal of Politics. Professor Menon is the recipient of the WISCOMP Sahas Prajna Award 2020 for her contributions to feminist scholarship. She is an accomplished Carnatic musician and a Bharatanatyam dancer. Thank you, Professor Menon, for agreeing to steer today's dialogue. We also have with us Dr. Vijay Lakshmi Nanda. She is currently principal of Miranda House, where she is associate professor at the Department of Political Science. She is a recipient of the ICSSR Doctoral Fellowship and the Delhi University Vice Chancellor's Teachers Excellence Award. Dr. Nanda is actively associated with a number of government and non-government organizations in advisory capacity on gender policy and advocacy programs with youth. She has provided technical assistance on gender issues to UNFPA, UNDP, UN Women, and the WHO. Her research and activism on sex selective abortion in India is well known in policy circles and in women's rights group. A warm welcome to you, Dr. Nanda. On the panel also is Professor Rukmini Sen. She is professor at School of Liberal Studies at Dr. Ambedkar University, Delhi. She is currently also director of the Center for Publishing at the university. She offers courses on law and society, relationships and affinities, culture, hierarchy, and difference. Professor Sen received the WISCOMP Sahas Award 2020 in recognition of her continuous innovation in curricula to promote gender justice in higher education. She's a member of the core group on women at the National Human Rights Commission. She's also an advisory board member with the Feminist Judgments Initiative at Gujarat National Law University. Thank you, Professor Sen, for joining us today. And then we have Dr. Deshant Kumar. He's assistant professor at the Department of Political Science at Miranda House. He teaches courses in political theory, political economy, Ambedkar, Gandhi, and governance. Dr. Deshant has studied at the Center for Political Studies and the Center for Study of Law and Governance at JNU. Together, the panelists bring teaching experience of well over half a century to the table. We look forward to their presentations and discussion. We hope they will provide new insights on the challenges of the pandemic and share what possibilities this disruption in higher education has opened up. Thank you, and over to you, Professor Menon.
Thank you, Seema. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, friends. At the outset, I'd like to thank the India International Center and WISCOMP for inviting us to this dialogue on pedagogy in the times of the pandemic. Through this and similar dialogues, Vijay Lakshmi Nanda, Rukmini Sen, Deshant Kumar, and I hope to listen, learn, and intervene meaningfully in our classrooms and institutions during these very difficult times. The COVID-19 pandemic has changed and is changing our world in many ways. It has compelled us to move beyond a worldview based on certitude and the arrogance of always being in control. This pandemic has taught us about the vulnerability of human life. It has taught us about interdependence and highlighted the inequalities of our societies. Unilateral, non consultative approaches to managing the pandemic have unfortunately resulted in large scale suffering, deaths, and devastation. Dialogue, effective and adequate communication of information and data, robust public health infrastructure, free press and social media, public spirited citizens, civil society groups, and of course, dedicated healthcare workers have come together and responded creatively and smartly to the challenges posed by the virus. It is in this spirit of dialogue that we embark upon our discussion, while respecting and centering the vulnerability, interdependence, and tenacity of life. Our focus today will be on the challenges faced by teachers, students, and administrators in higher education institutions in India during the pandemic and the ways in which they are working through this challenge. Should we continue as though it's business as usual, follow academic calendars, submission deadlines, course loads, and convocation dates as in the past? Or should this be a time to revisit our understanding of what it means to be educated? Do we work towards only formalized certification and the attendant rituals of completing the syllabus, holding examinations, and following the academic timetable with, some might say, near robotic efficiency? Or do we acknowledge our limitations as we try and grapple with this monumental challenge? We are faced with the question or questions such as, is the curriculum relevant even as families and communities are stalked by fear and loss of lives and livelihoods? Can our students be expected to continue to learn through the experiences that life is offering to them? In this case, the experiences of illness, grief, death, anxiety, loss of employment and livelihoods? Are the conventional examination and evaluation systems relevant when life itself is precariously placed? This calls for us to come forward with a refreshingly new approach to education. We are witnessing a total breakdown of what we imagined future to be. A time when questions such as, so what are you planning to do next, something that we teachers often ask our students, has become rather irrelevant. Education has borne the brunt of the pandemic in very specific ways. Students and teachers have had to keep away from the campus since distancing norms and lockdown policies across the world made it difficult to have face to face classes and interactions on campus. This resulted in an almost overnight and wholesale shift to online modes of academic work. Classes, seminars, tutorials, student presentations, assessment, discussion with research scholars, PhD viva voce examinations, and even international conferences are now being conducted online. The change had to be effected abruptly and without much preparation. How did this impact pedagogy and assessment? What, if any, has been the physical and psychological toll of staring long hours at small windows on computer screens been, both for students and educators? Of course, the push towards online classes and the use of digital technology in higher education predates the pandemic, but it has acquired a new status in the current context and is being promoted with almost an evangelical zeal by some experts. Will these online tools be game changers in higher education? There is no doubt that the thrust for online education must address the questions of access and disparities caused by the digital divide across class, rural urban location, caste, gender, and disabilities of various kinds, to name a few. Some experts have argued that online education dilutes the learning experience. There are serious pedagogical concerns that have been expressed about online classes, online education. The excitement, thrill, and indeed the transformative potential of the classroom, it is feared, would be lost forever. However, when we look at studies undertaken by researchers, we see that from an early skepticism, educators have indeed come gradually to embrace many aspects of virtual and online learning that are compatible with the democratic imagination of the higher education space. However, the serious limitations online education creates in deeply unequal societies such as ours remains a challenge that cannot be disregarded. To conceive of face to face classrooms and online learning as mutually exclusive shuts down the possibilities of exploring new ways of reimagining higher education. Studies on the influence and impact of distance and online education actually recommend innovative and locally contextualized pedagogical permutations, where, irrespective of the mode, learning remains foregrounded. While access to online learning is not equitable, Everybody knows that. But studies from settings as diverse as India, Slovenia, the United States of America suggest that some sections of students, some women students, queer students, students experiencing disabilities of various kinds, they actually seem to be able to participate freely and actively in online classes. They value these spaces for a variety of reasons, such as the ability to interact with a certain degree of anonymity that it affords, especially for people who might not conform to traditional gender binaries or are nervous in front of large groups. Many women in these studies have actually reported that they find online modes compatible with their childcare and other care responsibilities. Students whose mobility is restricted have appreciated the online mode for freeing them from having to navigate the physical space of the university campus. Time management remains a critical issue for many women students with their multiple responsibilities. The flexibility that the online system offers has found an appreciation from these students. In our context, access and inclusivity remain important concerns while discussing online education. Equally significant is the question of what would be considered knowledge. Can our students, who like us, are coping with death and grief, continue to learn and take exams as before? The pandemic has compelled us to think about the place of emotions, feelings, empathy, and compassion within the higher education space. Fortunately, for us, some leading educational institutions in the city of Delhi demonstrated these qualities in ample measure and reminded us that education is a therapeutic act, and built into it is intelligence, ethics of care, and a deep sensitivity to life. Vijay Lakshmi Nanda, what were your thoughts when you and your students and colleagues embarked upon the helpline services for COVID management? We would like to understand the motivation behind the initiative and what did you intend to achieve through your efforts?
Thank you. At the outset, I would like to thank IIC and WISCOMP for this opportunity and for this conversation. Thank you, Professor Menon and Professor Gopinath and Seema Kakran. Thank you for initiating this conversation. I would like to say, when the second wave happened, that is the time when, in the first wave, we were looking mainly at inclusion, at equity, at accessibility when it came to digital learning. We were not really involved with the health crisis per se. But it is in the second wave that the health crisis became the major challenge for all of us. And that is at that point that one reached out to students to find out if there is a way in which we could reach out to all the students in the college. Because as you know, we were all online and, because the diversity of Delhi University is such that students in Miranda House are placed all over India. So we thought if there was a way in which we could consolidate a particular helpline which could reach out, be of some support. We did have a mental health counselor list of the college. And that is when the students reached out to me. And this is where I understood the resilience of the youth and the way in which they had been thinking. And they combined in them, and this is, of course, coming from a college which has an outstanding legacy of leadership and mentorship by teachers and administrative leaders. However, having said that, the students showed immense resilience and they moved forward and they created this help desk all on their own. But what went into it, Professor Menon, was a strategic planning. There was strategic planning, there was imagination built into it, looking at the various helplines. There was this young student who came forward and said, Shrishti Sen Sharma, that I will do this, I will take this forward. She was a third-year student in philosophy, and she reached out to students in the NSS and other friends, and they all joined hands, and they were all over in the country. It was not just in Delhi. And through remote, methods, they were able to be connected. And that was the first space that one looked at, the online space, as a way to reach out. So while it was online space was a way for us to teach, it became a way for us to reach out. And this strategic planning was driven by compassion. It was fueled by their capabilities. So in that sense, what you said, that it was about, about looking at ethics of care, looking at compassion. So there was trust, there was courage, there was clarity, there was a certain kind of a precision in the way in which they were able to do it. However, it was meant only for the college. But at the point when they started the helpline, their numbers went out, as it is through online methods. So they were, other people from all over the city started reaching out to them. And therein came our major kind of challenge. How are we going to protect these students from the kind of burden that was being placed on them because of this particular helpline? I mean, they could not cater to the whole city. And that is when we decided to have a meeting. We do have a COVID task force in the college, which includes teachers and non-teaching staff. And we had a discussion, and the students said that now that we are here and there are people reaching out to us, we will not be able to say no. So that is why I think, apart from using the terminology of COVID warriors, we need to talk about COVID healers. And I think in that sense, the teachers, the students who are offering this kind of a service, they became the COVID healers. They were ready to overcome these challenges, and they were able to continue with that service for all over the city and sometimes all over India by creating the lists and the kind of spreadsheets that they had created, which is enough to make us understand that it was a crisis response which was looking at democratic decision making. So what they did, irrespective of their own issues, and they had many, they embraced the chaos and they saw it as a creative space to engage with a larger opportunity to reach out to others and bring about a certain kind of a support system. And it is not to say that they were not troubled by that. There were students who were troubled by this, by the fact that it would have, there was a burden that led to mental health crisis for some of them. We tried through our mental health counselors to support them. We also tried that we could bring in a certain one-to-one mentorship for them. However, they also reached out through their parents who were a part of this support group again. So it became like a emotional connect driven by compassion, driven by empathy, and these creative emotional connections were strategic, they were planned, and I think this is where the future of work lies. These are the young people who have certain capabilities which has to be measured against the other kind of capabilities that were measured earlier, and this is the time for us to look at those capabilities. So I think I feel this was empathy training in every sense of the term, empathy training in the way it should be. So I would like to say that this is basically the crux of what we did with the help desk. There were other colleges also who joined, and there are many colleges now which have done far more important work. I would like to also state that.
This is truly inspirational, Vijay Lakshmi. And, to conceive of the future of work as creative, emotional, and compassionate, that really is, I think, the way we would like to take this dialogue further. And I think the key words from your response were democratic decision making, students and educators as healers and not just warriors who are there to wage a war. So moving away from that militaristic language, these are, I think, extremely important and sensitive observations that you have made. And there is so much humility in the efforts, in the description of the efforts of your students, your colleagues, and your administration, where you acknowledge that there were many challenges and students had to reach out. I think these are some of the key elements that should hopefully inform response to crisis management across the world. So there is much to learn from your efforts. From the institutional level that Vijay Lakshmi spoke about right now, we now segue to the classroom and the interaction between the faculty members and the students and research scholars. Rukmini Sen, as a sociologist, you must have observed the social inequalities that have been exacerbated by the online processes. We would like to hear from you. about the various ways in which this has manifested itself in the classroom, in the relationship between teachers and supervisors and students, and how have you and your colleagues navigated these differences?
I would also first like to thank IIC WISCOMP Dialogues for holding this timely conversation. Thank you, Professor Menon, Professor Gopinath, Seema Kakran, and Dr. Vijay Lakshmi Nanda for setting the tone of this dialogue. I speak from the experience of online teaching, both BA and MA classes, as well as doing research supervision with students at a public funded Delhi government university. It is important to remember that in India, access to and completing higher education is a tool of social transformation, where although over the years the gender gap has decreased, the same may not be said about other forms of marginalities, notably caste, ethnic identities, or disability. The classroom, which due to the pandemic is now qualified as the physical or in-person classroom, have acted as an important site for interaction, interrogation, and interpretation. It is necessary to point out that this classroom has had its share of inequalities depending upon the social background of the student, language skills, accessible academic content, or ways of coping with career-oriented demands of higher education. The pandemic and its shift to online classes have changed as well as challenged the nature of pedagogy. The inequalities now start with basic infrastructure. Number one, is there a space in the home to do classes continuously for a few hours each day? Questions about whether the student has a separate room, a corner of a room available for listening to classes become relevant. Number two, is there an electronic device with adequate and high-speed internet access to be a part of the class uninterrupted? Also, internet connectivity sometimes may not reach inside the home and may be best accessible at the terrace or the ground outside the house. So those spaces could also be from where the class happens for the student. Number three, is there a desktop or a laptop where students can write their assignments and submit for evaluation? These foundational inequalities demonstrate that the library, the computer lab, the common room, the canteen, the sports facilities of a college or a university all complement the classroom, not only in learning, but also in the broadening of horizons, interacting with students who come from plural backgrounds for whom these interactions would otherwise not have been possible through the rigid caste community networks within which we usually lead our everyday lives. Thus, coming to campus is valuable for sociological reasons as much as for personal growth, mobility, transformation. I would, however, also like to add, as we already heard Professor Menon earlier, that for students, sometimes the anonymity factor worked positively. Being able to type on the chat box certain questions or comments as opposed to speaking out in class has been enabling for some. Also, students with physical disability or mild forms of emotional stress have expressed their comfort on not having to travel or pressures of social interaction. But issues related to screen time, attention span, access to online reading materials, possibilities of interaction all become vital with respect to experiences in online teaching and learning processes. Keeping these in mind and these challenges into consideration as part of both the BA and the MA courses that I transacted through the online mode, there were certain alterations in reading materials that I did. While I always had used visual content, for the first time I used interviews or audio-visual lectures. For example, there is a wonderful interview of Bama done by Geeta Hariharan on Dalit women writing memoirs, women's movements, and ways in which gender and caste intersect everyday lives for the BA course on culture, identity, and society. There were certain changes that we did also with respect to assignment. For example, for the MA course on relationships and affinities, students did photo essays and or short audio video texts and notes on pandemic, lockdown and relationships in the 2020 iteration, and crisis, relationship and care in the 2021 iteration. These originally used to be 2,500 word term papers, but changes were made keeping in mind absence of gadgets to write long essays. And I was also trying to experiment with and see how the students could learn with smartphones. The learning that happened to all of us in the discipline was that there are ways in which we need to also discuss and teach crisis and care, because clearly it was crisis which led to certain forms of alterations, and it was also the lens of care through which both us and the students were engaging with the situation. Finally, with research scholars, the challenge was to get them to write. With research already being a lonely exercise, the absence of a community of researchers was felt more with the pandemic. There were negotiations and changes that scholars needed to know about their field work. To be an empathetic listener and provide care and support to one's research students much beyond their academic work has been a constant throughout the pandemic. To be able to discuss vulnerability, grief, illness, healing, that was something that we felt was what we were doing with our research scholars. Pressures of completing the thesis or parents planning marriages, experiencing psychological depression or lack of faith, self-worth. I think for the research scholars, just being there as an anchor point acted as a pedagogy of care. So this was the most important learning through the last 1 year, experiencing and exploring pedagogies of care.
Thank you, Rukmini. Pedagogies of care. I think we add this phrase to all the very beautiful terms that Vijay Lakshmi has already shared with us. And I noted with great interest what you said about the need for students and teachers to engage with the idea of crisis and care. How do societies, how do communities respond to crisis? What kinds of care mechanisms do they evolve? What kind of an impact does it have on social and community and familial networks? I suppose these and similar questions must have been discussed in your very, very engaging classrooms. I particularly was, very keen to learn more about your very, very innovative evaluation approach that you have adopted during the pandemic. But that could be a conversation for some time later. Thank you very much. I think these would be very helpful for others as well who are trying to grapple with the challenge of what kind of work to set for students that would have some meaning and relevance in their lives. I now turn to Deshant. Deshant Kumar is a relatively new entrant into the higher education space. So Deshant, as in your new role as a faculty member, what have you learned from the challenges posed by the shift to online classes? How do you think the larger economic and social issues are impacting the online classrooms?
Thank you, Professor Menon. First of all, I would like to thank WISCOMP and IIC for bringing me in this dialogue with such an esteemed panel. I thank Professor Gopinath and Dr. Seema for channelizing this. Professor Menon, as a young teacher, I think in my personal experience, I've become sensitive to the political economy of education. We used to see that there are economic disparities in the batches when we were students. But as a teacher, I have the privilege to have the bird eye view, in which I can, look at the batch and I can sense and see economy. So I would like to, answer this question from a political economy perspective. Uh, as rightly said by Professor Nanda and Professor Sen, that social inequalities are grappling our all imaginations for a digital education. But it's not that the pandemic has brought these kind of issues. Digital divide and exclusions were already present. According to the National Sample Survey Office report 2018, only on an average 9% households have digital infrastructure, and that also 21% in urban and only 4% in rural. So these kind of realities are visible to me now in the class, and this is not something which the pandemic has brought. The pandemic at most has brought two things. It has intensified the already existing rifts and the digital divide, and it has exposed our capacities, our inabilities to be egalitarian and inclusive. With all our very best efforts, I am a little bit pessimistic as a young teacher. I don't know, with time my perspective might change. In my experience as a teacher, I think it is important to ask this question, that who is the student we are teaching? Who is this average student we are teaching? Average in the sense, who is not only, we are not talking about Delhi or Bombay or Bangalore, but on an average throughout the country. This is a student who belongs to the average household in a country which is running a vast informal economy. So the sheer lack of physical infrastructure and social infrastructure is visible when we ignore the small industries and informal sectors, which comprises of the 95% of the economy. When there are no regulatory structures or no relief from everyday social oppression, and when the pandemic hits, there is destruction of livelihood and lowering levels of nutrition in the context of completely inadequate social protection, and a sheer dip in public spending, and loan burden on households rising. Families of our students, there are families of our students who have lost all sources of income. You know, in such a context, in such a state of economy, I, as a teacher, can see this situation of economy translating in my students. In this troubled economy, our students need laptop and computer with fast internet, as said by Professor Singh. They have to pay for PGs that they couldn't vacate due to lockdown. The outstation students, and we should remember that there have been suicides due to lack of digital infrastructure. So these are the political economy background around this entire experience as a young teacher is on my face. It's troubling me. Even before this kind of a pandemic, in our so-called normal lives, students used to, in offline mode, also hide the state of their economy, their background, because many a time for many students, their economic background becomes source of embarrassment. It lowers their confidence. They want to be equal, for instance, in the elite cosmopolitan culture of Delhi. And in the online mode, when the classroom has entered their homes, their family issues, their personal life disturbances, their unsupportive house infrastructure, all that is visible. And they are embarrassed. I can sense that. And that's why they are hesitant to switch on their mics and cameras. And without these mics and cameras, pedagogy is further dehumanized. So if you ask me what is the challenge to pedagogy, in my experience as a young scholar, as a young teacher, I would say that regardless of the pandemic, we are moving towards a new kind of economy, which is filled with artificial intelligence, machines, unimaginable technology, creative destruction, and rapid digitalization. And this is a global phenomenon. And we have our country, a developing country, with a context of high informality, lack of protection, unemployment, excess labor, unavailability of growth avenues, income disparity, exclusion, marginalization, and education, training, and job market. All of that is translating into anxiety and stress in our student. So when the student, I've experienced this, When the student looks at a new course, she asks, how much hope I have in this course in terms of the scope of the course. Meaning, she asks, how much scope it has, what kind of job this course can get me. She's concerned with money and job security for all obvious reasons. So at this point, education in this context is leading to commodification of the mind. Students judge themselves with the amount of money they can command in the economy. And when it comes to online education, students have a feeling of betrayal. For majority of students, we know that education is an investment for a fortunate future. And they now not only feel a loss in finances, but also a loss of hope. Students are living in hyper competition to remain relevant for this new economy. Fear and anxiety has rooted in the learner. There is duality of success and failure which has taken over. And there is unending fight with the reproduction of social inequalities. So when it comes to this unwarranted glorification and rapid introduction of online teaching learning, in a situation of unimaginably high disparity, I agree with your points, Professor Menon, that it has a democratizing role, enabling role. But I am a little bit pessimistic about it because it cannot at all substitute. There are certain people who think that it can replace the physical, the offline education, but certainly it cannot. And digitalized education in this new economy, and then dealing with this pandemic loss, you are right. Professor Nanda is also right. It has lost the wonder I've experienced, the curiosity, the real-time experience, the thrownness and experiments of life. In Tagore's language, poetry and music in learning. And especially in Miranda House, I've experienced that, and it is the experience all over, that students, we should understand the social psychology of architecture, not the grandeur of the architecture, but the belonging to the space of learning. Our students really miss those red bricks. That's why in farewells, they have used the background of those red bricks. So that longing is visible, and I can sense it. And the other thing which I have experienced is that education certainly is not merely dissemination of knowledge, theory, facts, or simply skill development for new techno-digital economy. It is, as Dr. Nanda said, awakening of consciousness and sensibilities. Classroom, I firmly believe, is an ecosystem of diversity and possibilities. And teaching is direct, living engagement, not possible on virtual screen. How can I teach multidimensional virtues and values? How can I inculcate them in my students? When these values are multidimensional and my screen is two-dimensional. And also, apart from that, these assignments and then entrances, all the anxiety to go abroad for certain section of students, and then for certain sections of students to resume even their normal education. It has been clouded in the dubious arguments of value neutrality and standardized quantification of mind and talent as the economy demands. So I think, as far as I have in my short experience, I think that the critical imaginative role of pedagogy and the role of pedagogy in creating aspiration, empathy, and generosity, it is being diluted. It is being severely impinged. And therefore, the role of a teacher is very challenging in these times. And I wonder many a time, how do we console our students? How do we instill hope in them in this new economy beyond this pandemic time? I think, with mentorship, with the right mentorship I have, I'm privileged. I think with time I will learn.
Thank you, Deshant. This is the kind of passion that we must look for in teachers, and it's so reassuring to hear that passion in your note. I think it is really nobody's case here that we would like to, not advocate one at the cost of another. I think the idea of a dialogue really is to be able to say that there is a crisis and we need to respond to that crisis. How do we do it with the inclusivity, access, dignity, safety? All of these are concerns for us, and you're absolutely right about the challenges that students in societies like ours face. And it is for us, it's not for anybody else. It's for us in the higher education space to address these issues creatively and imaginatively with compassion and an ethics of care. In that context, Vijay Lakshmi, I was curious, you did mention about the challenges that your students faced. What were the kind of challenges that your students faced when they embarked upon this phenomenal effort? What were some of the challenges? How did you and the faculty members and the students themselves, how did they cope with those challenges, both psychological challenges as well as violation of their privacy and identity being revealed on public platforms? How did you cope with that?
Thank you, Professor Menon, for that question. Now, one of the things that a student once told me when they were facing these problems is that this is a particular crisis we have never faced. So what are the things that we should do about it? How are we going to respond to this challenge? So while the major focus for us was through developing a consensus. So while we had the COVID task force, which included teachers, we also had our college counselor and a number of mental health counselors who were part of this particular conversation. So we tried to take it up with them. We tried our best to have them speak and discuss. But there were times when they would go into deep silence. And anxiety, not being able to provide support and realizing that even if you provided support, there have been deaths that have taken place. All of that did impact them. And that, one of the major focuses that we had is that we are not to go ahead with first aid counseling. So the importance of trained counselors comes to the fore here. So we were very insistent that whatever support that should be provided has to be through trained counselors, and students as well as teachers as well as the mental health counselors kept that in mind, that one of the major kind of concerns we have is we should not try first aid counseling, and we continue to do that, and that is a major no for us. So that the other thing is a mental health response protocol. Who is asking for that support? What is the background of that particular student? Where is she located at present? So keeping all of that in mind, we tried to have a response protocol which was aligned with the particular student who was seeking that support. But having said that, I must tell you that we were not the only kind of support for them, not the college only. The Delhi University also had a range of mental health counselors who were available to them. Students themselves created their resources. However, again, I want to share, and since this is the kind of sharing that is necessary, one of the challenges was to make it sustainable. And the key to sustainability was to be able to maintain a particular balance. And these were young students who had risen to a particular occasion, but they were not trained to run a help desk of that kind of a quality and the kind of support or the kind of questions that were being asked of them. So one had to then think of referral services. One had to think of, at a time when they have to close that particular help desk. When do you think, which is the point of time when they have to withdraw that support, and what is it that they can provide? So all of that was worked out through a certain kind of strategic planning. But more than strategic planning, more than, it was the fact that we were open to listening. I think Rukmini also brought up that point, the idea of empathetic listening. So our phone lines were open to our students. Anytime a student could call us, or she could send out a message, and we were open to listening to them. In terms of privacy, yes, considering they are all women students, and there were cases where they were asked to be part of a support structure, or go and deliver a particular, let's say, oxygen cylinder somewhere, where they noticed that they were all hoax calls. And those were the kind of situations where also their privacy being invaded in ways, and also them being challenged and questioned and saying that, this particular lead did not work. So your system does not work. So those kind of questions became very demotivating. So one of the ways in which we tried our best was to develop a certain sense of security for them, and look at enabling spaces or free spaces. So if they wanted to step out, or if they wanted to say no, and they wanted to just close down the help desk, they were welcome to do that. And it is a young student who told me, and I find it very important to state it here. She said that, the idea of hope emerged. And this is when she says that Helen Keller says, although the world is full of suffering, it is also full of the overcoming of it. So they did say that, yes, there is a fear, there is this kind of a invasion of our privacy, or we are not able to manage, there's too much of a burden. But at some point of time, there was a sense that they were doing something significant and they were contributing to a certain support. So they were concerned citizens contributing to nation building. And I did see that as a message of hope, while understanding that they were challenged and there were ways that we needed to protect them and enable them and create a secure environment for them. So these were the few things that we did think of, and these were the challenges we looked at. And also, I think it's most important also for us to train our faculty, because crisis response or even mental health protocols, it is not a one-off, and one needs to be, and even I would like to say that even I am not equipped and I need to learn about it, learn more about it. So thank you for that question.
Thank you, Vijay Lakshmi. So where there's suffering, but there's yet hope, that's the message that we need to convey to our students and colleagues. And of course, there's fear, but there's also, when you engage in tasks that are bigger than yourself, there is a sense of purpose, and there is a awareness that you're contributing to something bigger than you. Thank you for those observations. Rukmini, since a great deal of your work, your research, writing has been around the theme of violence in contemporary societies, how do you think this violence manifested itself in the higher education space during the pandemic? Have you do you have any observations about this as yet, or do you think it's too early to actually speak about it, or are there some tentative directions in which you are thinking? We'd really be curious to hear your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Krishna, for that question. And I would think that it's a mix of both, of certain things that we are seeing and certain things that we are seeing probably not in the higher education space immediately, but in maybe school systems, and certain analogies that may be drawn. So the pandemic actually has shown us in various ways, rather than saying shown us, only reiterated in various ways how gendered the space of the home is. The UN has talked about the increase in domestic violence during the pandemic. And as we all know, the UN has talked about something called the shadow pandemic. And this was as early as April 2020, the UN came up with a report. The National Commission for Women in India had announced a WhatsApp helpline number for the first time to address more ways of complaining about domestic violence. And that also happened last April. So clearly, in multiple ways, we were actually seeing that the home has become a more violent space. And it is important to keep in mind that home was also the space of education, because students were not being able to go to the educational institutions. So to that extent, there would have been gendered impacts also about access to education. But with respect to spaces of education or higher education, there are three things that I would like to say. Number one, women students, as we all know, do play the role of caregivers. And I think the pandemic has actually shown it in multiple ways that we've, and students themselves have shared it with me and some of our colleagues, that they have been helping their mothers in kitchen, they have been aiding with siblings' education or other forms of nurturance, or even being the caregivers when the infection has spread in the home. So I would think that these ways of gender-based discrimination is something that we did experience. Secondly, as per a report, very recent report that was published in the Frontline in January 21, 10 million girls in India could actually drop out of secondary education due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And this has come from the Right to Education Forum policy brief. What I'm trying to suggest is, although this is data from school, this will in the long run have some impact on access to higher education, gendered impact on access to higher education. The third thing, in India, the poorest girls and those who live in rural areas have much less access to technology than boys. And Deshant has already mentioned that. As per, again, a recent report, GSMA, the Mobile Gender Gap Report, there exists a 50% gender gap in mobile internet users in India. Moreover, an assessment on issues faced by adolescents during COVID-19 found that more boys than girls had access to digital infrastructure such as mobile phones, internet services, radio, media. So again, these are surveys which has been done in the context of school, but their spillover into higher education in the years to come is something that we will have to wait and see. There was something very poignant and interesting that one student, shared with me, and she said, woman student, and she had articulated that the pandemic has brought in a role reversal. The students were playing the role of caring for adults in the households rather than the reverse. And in many ways, they were unprepared for it. And I think it was, of course, this particular statement that a student made, but also generally the way in which we were interacting with students. That is one of the reasons why in answer to the previous question, I've been thinking that it is an important time to think about courses around crisis and care. Finally, all of this also tells us the need to do more research on long-term gendered impact of the pandemic. With education shifting home, its impact on students, its impact on faculty. But education has shifted home. There is also work from home, and there is the already existing domestic labor within the home on which feminists have talked about for years. So there is a requirement, I feel, of advocating citizenship education, pedagogic engagement with the Constitution, fundamental rights and responsibilities, the Bill of Rights of the Justice Verma Committee in higher educational institutions, in order to create a future generation who both understand about everyday social hierarchies, are empathetic about it, as well as conscious about the ways of eradicating these hierarchies to create a more gender-just, egalitarian society. These are the ways in which I would think the question around violence and gender-based violence can be addressed within higher educational institution spaces now, but also in the years to come.
Thank you, Rukmini, and thank you for trying to, compress so many complex ideas into a very brief time span. I really appreciate that. I'm sure all of us are sensitive to the time factor. So I really, really appreciate the fact that you tried to bring in so many complex ideas and the connection that you made between enrollment figures in schools and the impact that it would have in the long run on higher education spaces. I think that's very important. And the closing remarks that you had in response to this question of mine about citizenship education and making a connection between fundamental rights and our ability to have empathy and care for each other as citizens. I think these are valuable lessons that we will need to now incorporate into our revised curriculum. And I hope we are going to revise our curriculum sooner than later. So I think we will move on to the question. And Deshant, the question for you really. So we'll begin with the questions, and I'll start with asking you a question. My request to all of you would be to keep your answers brief so that we can take more questions. So Deshant, in your classroom, how have you attempted to address the digital gap and the digital divide? What have been some of the ways that you have adopted to address these challenges?
Ma'am, there is a limitation to how we could do, but we were constantly innovating ways in which we could somersault this digital divide and somehow help our students. As Dr. Nanda said in Miranda House, the diversity is such that students are placed everywhere in the country, and so what we did is we tried to also, this was one innovative way, we also tried to post the study material through India Post, and it did reach, and we received also on phone calls and other methods that students were really happy to receive our notes. And we also asked our other class students to compile study material and their own personal notes so that we could help these students. So we identified those students and tried to did it. Secondly, we also, for instance, it was a time when Kashmir, was facing connectivity issues, and I had students from Assam and Nagaland who were facing internet short. So what we did is I took help from some of these students to create portals of phone conferencing. So we would take them on cellular calls, and it really worked. Initially, I was hesitant that it wouldn't work, but it did. So those were the kind of ways in which I tried to address the digital divide. Secondly, the standard methodology of creating Google Classrooms and then trying to be on different platforms. So not just Zoom, not just Google Meet, or not just Skype. We tried to be on different platforms. So we had WhatsApp calls as well, apart from regular phone calls. So we approached almost all possible technological method we had in our place.
Thank you. Thank you, Dushyant. I think these are very important points that you've made, and useful for any other teacher who's listening in and would like to try. Vijay Lakshmi, there is a question from Dr. Meenakshi Gopinath, and she would like to know what steps your institution has initiated to bridge the digital divide that exists in your classroom. As an institution, what has been the response from your college?
Thank you, Dr. Gopinath, for that question. We have, as all other colleges have, we have tried our best to bring in as much of support as we could through the various systems that teachers were able to provide their students. But apart from that, we did have a resource of laptops, which we were able to provide certain students who could reach out to us. Other than that, teachers were able to provide through economic support, data cards and other things. And of course, the major concern for them was those areas which could not be connected by internet. So therein, telephone calls were used, materials were sent to them. All of that was done. But having said that, was it enough? I would say no. I think there is a lot more that needs to be done. And it is here that our major challenge exists, because we are public, universities and public funded colleges. And therefore, it is important that there has to be a certain support that has to come in from alumni, from other network, where we are able to align them with the needs of our students. So every student has a particular need. But teachers have really provided a lot of support. So have the students. But one of the things that worked very well was a mentorship program, or a peer mentorship program, that was conducted by students themselves. So their support to each other through their own methods, and providing them materials, trying to find ways of connecting them with the teacher if they were not able to be connected. There were times when students did not want to be part of online classes because they would feel overburdened by the classroom experience itself on an online mode. It would develop anxiety. So at that point of time also, the other students would provide them with information that they would gather from the class and manage to connect with the teacher. So while there would be these financial resources which we really require, we also require a lot of emotional resources. That is why the emphasis on compassion, the emphasis on realizing that we can make mistakes as institutions, that we can learn from each other. The idea here now is to connect ourselves with other institutions and find ways for a collective, kind of collective way of dealing with the situation, a collective way of providing greater digital inclusion and accessibility. So these are, for me, the ways to look at institutions. Every institution is doing its best. And Delhi University, we are part of the federal structure of Delhi University. It has also supported us. There are government funding that we have used. But yet, I think there is a need for alumni to reach out. There is a need for people who have resources to reach out to us, because it is a collective choice how we want our young people to contribute to the larger nation building, or to the country as citizens. So if we do not reach out now, there is no way that we will be able to bridge that particular gap. So to be alert and to be sensitive to the intersectionality of vulnerabilities, not just to the fact of just one kind of equity, but class and other kinds of digital divides that exist. It could be region. Region did come up as a major area that we needed to look at. So these were the multiple crises and some of our small, responses to that. But we are trying our best, and we are trying to learn also from all around us.
Yes, I think it's very important that we show to our students and the young people how to deal with the crisis of this magnitude, because they are looking at us, they are observing us, and in that they are learning very big and important life lessons. Rukmini, there is a question for you from Professor Meeta Narayan of School of Languages from JNU. And the question really is revolving around assessment and evaluation on the online, on digital platforms. You know, there is a lot of concern about the copy paste culture that we are unfortunately sometimes we witness our students doing that. So how do you cope with that? What are the kind of methodologies that we may evolve to address this? And why do you think students are forced to do that? These are some of the questions. I mean, there are too many questions here and far too complex, but some thoughts on this.
Thank you very much for the question, Professor Naren. And I think I'll address it in maybe 2 or 3 points. Number one is, while I completely take on board, this larger thing around copy paste culture, I suppose many teachers in many ways for a long time have been thinking about different ways of assessments within a broader broader standardized system itself. Of course, there are situations where assessments are not do not have a template, and there is more scope for creativity, but at the same point of time, altering modes of assessment is something which has been going on. One of the things which I feel will be very, very valuable when we think about creative modes of assessment is that what is it that we are testing in the student. And one of the things that I think the pandemic has taught us is that the point is necessarily not always to complete our syllabus. But the point is to provide students with certain kinds of learnings. And these are, let's say, how do you read a text? What do you understand from a text? What is it that you're interpreting from it? And if you had to talk about, and if you had to write about this text critically and creatively, then how would you do it? So I'm kind of trying to think that when we think about assignment situations differently, then these are things that needs to be kept in mind. A second thing is that when we rethink assessments, it is also important to have the students on board. And this is something that at least I have been trying to do with the students. I generally do a very detailed write-up on what the assessment is all about and what is it that I'm expecting from the students of the assessment. And then actually do a class, sometimes even tutorials with students, especially if they're undergraduate students, about the ways in which whether they have understood the assessment properly. Even understanding the assessment is necessary, because I sometimes feel that we might alter the assignment, we might be creative about the assignment, but it can backfire if the student doesn't actually engage with it. So to have the student collaboratively also on board, I'm not suggesting that the student has to decide what the assignment would be, but to at least know that the student has understood what are the terms of references of that assessment. I think that's a second important thing to be kept in mind. And a third thing is that just like there is a stress on the student to get a higher grade, and that has been one thought attached to this copy paste system culture, etc., but there is also a stress on on the faculty as well, and especially during the pandemic, the stress about how is it that you mitigate the fact that you are not there physically in front of the students when they are taking the test. So multiple modes could be thought about, I suppose. Open book examinations is one kind of a thing where we actually do not give direct questions, but we rethink, again, as I said, what is it that we are trying to test. An attempt that I tried to do, as I said in that example of photo essays or audio visual notes from students, it was basically to try and understand how is it that the student is understanding or even living and healing and caring during the times of the pandemic. And it is literally turning the gaze on oneself and trying to do it through photographs. So photographs can speak for themselves, visuals can speak for themselves. So that was an effort that one did, because I think that our assignment structures are also very focused on trying to test only written abilities of students. It's important for us to probably widen the number of things that we are also trying to understand from students, not just written skills, but also their ability to assess and understand a situation that they are living. So yeah, I would think that these are the three different kinds of responses that I have to the question that was asked.
Thank you, Rukmini. Thank you for very concrete suggestions and responses. I think it's always very useful to be able to have these clear takeaways, and that's possible because you have obviously thought a great deal about these issues. Vartika Sharma has it's a very important question that she has raised, but I'm not going to take it up because we must now move towards winding up. The question really is concerned with the psychological impact of online classes. And Deshant has already spoken about it very eloquently. Vijay Lakshmi has spoken about the told that digital classes, use of digital technology for even compassionate and care purposes, when you try to create that Google spreadsheet, the kind of psychological trolling, bullying that some of the students had to experience. Rukmini spoken about violence, and clearly a lot of this is anxiety, which is due to the uncertainties of the times that we are living in. So we really need to have another dialogue actually to address the question of the psychological toll that it's taking both on teachers and students, and of course the administrators who are trying very hard to keep students and teachers who are in very diverse and different locations together, even while they are not physically present in the space of the campus. So thank you everybody for your very frank and thoughtful responses. One of the challenges as a consequence of this shift to online teaching has, of course, been the lack of training. And as Vijay Lakshmi said, we are not trained counselors. All of us don't have those kind of skills. There are so many more skills to acquire than simply learning how to use the Zoom platform. Of course, we need to be trained for that, but that's least of the concerns here. The shift to online learning actually requires us to be trained in very many other things, much more than the digital skills that is being focused upon. That's very important. We, of course, need to know how to get on those digital platforms, but we need to, as Deshant warned us earlier, we need to get to know the human beings behind those windows and the kind of situations that they belong to and the kind of challenges that they are facing, even as they are trying to be attentive students in class, meticulous research scholars. These are some of the skills that I think all of us need training in. The pandemic has stripped us in the universities and colleges of our familiar experiences. And yet, a vast range of new possibilities has opened up. We need to continue to explore ways to make the learning spaces, whether it's physical or online, inclusive and accessible, creative and compassionate. I think this is the challenge in the days to come. So, with this, I end this dialogue here. Thank you, Seema, very much for having us. We really enjoyed listening to all the panelists, and I hope you and the other listeners also did so.
Thank you, Professor Menon. Thank you, Vijay Lakshmi, Dushyant, and Rukmini, for that really invigorating dialogue. Thank you to everyone in the audience who joined us, and we hope that you will join us next time too. We want to extend our gratitude to IIC and the Syncline Tech team, Nishant particularly, for helping us with all of the technology and at least equipping us enough that we are able to manage this online presence well. Thank you, everyone, and good day.
Thank you.